Today we're having a look at groups that experience food inequity. Last week we looked at the causes of food inequity, so now we're going to have a look at who actually experiences food inequity. The first thing I want you to get a sense of is the difference between developed and developing countries. In your glossary of terms, you should have a definition for developed and developing countries, but if you just have a look, pause for a minute and have a look at the different characteristics, you'll see that developed countries actually have really high levels of employment, education, technology, infrastructure, income, life expectancy, and developing countries have the opposite of that. So just pause, make some notes on some of the main things that are different between these two types of countries. The groups we're going to be focusing on today are rural people, people with low income, the homeless, women and children, the elderly, and people who are chronically ill. That's the 6 groups who we determine as being the main people who experience food inequity. The first group we're going to have a look at is the rural and isolated communities. Across the world and in Australia, we have communities who don't have access to food because they just live too far from all the goods and services. So that access is the main thing there. You can imagine if you lived somewhere like the top right picture, that getting food to you might be more difficult than where you live now in Australia. So the price of food transport obviously increases with distance. And refrigerated transport is more expensive as well. So when they start adding all of these costs on, people who live out in rural communities are actually paying more for their food than what we are paying when we're close to main centres. So you can imagine fruit, vegetables and meat, it's really difficult to get them out, and they're the things that are really high in nutrients. A lot of the rural communities are actually Indigenous people, and those Indigenous people are already experiencing higher levels of things like diabetes, heart disease and obesity. So the fact that they're not getting adequate nutrition is just compounding that. Just the lack of access to fresh produce because of lack of roads and rails just means that they're not getting those nutrients from fruit and vegetables. The second group who experience food inequity is people who just don't have enough money or who are unemployed. So when you don't have enough money, people actually have to make priorities about what they're going to spend their money on, and sometimes good food is just not a priority. This is more of a case in developing countries. Their average income is a lot less than here in Australia, but food is actually becoming increasingly expensive, so it doesn't take much. Even if you're making quite a good income, food is still really expensive. So I want you to have a think about, if you had to pay for everything yourself, would healthy food be up there on your priority list, or would making sure you had phone credit be more of a priority to you? Just have a look at the graph on the right hand side of the screen. It's actually an international comparison of hourly pay. It's in manufacturing, so it's not across all industries, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea about who's getting paid the most in the world. If you have a look at those top countries, Australia is actually third there, just below Denmark and Switzerland, which are known to be very rich countries. So we've got all of our developed countries up the top who are getting paid more money than if you look down the bottom. We've got people India, China, Philippines, Brazil, Estonia, Argentina. So that just gives you an indication. I think that top one is actually $40 an hour, and probably moving down to that $1 an hour. I've also got some links there on the left, which I'll put on the virtual classroom for you. Just have a look at the income across the world. So by now you should have some notes written on the first 2 groups. The third group here is homeless people. So obviously homeless people have got nowhere to prepare or store their foods, and that's actually very limiting in the type of foods that they can buy. They haven't got money to purchase food. Nutrition is probably not a very high priority. They're just looking for something to fill their stomachs. But in developed countries like Australia, we're very lucky because they have the option of soup kitchens here, and there's also food vouchers which are handed out by aid agencies just to help people who are homeless to actually get a meal. So you could imagine 2 homeless people, they're trying to get whatever food they can get, and some of that is probably really poor quality and not very high in nutrition. It's actually quite astounding to have a look at the homeless statistics in Australia. So I want you to pause for a minute, go through. These are from homelessnessaustralia.org.au. Just have a look and see what makes up people who are homeless and who are homeless and where they are in Australia. The fourth group who don't have access to food are women and children. So women particularly have higher nutritional requirements, particularly of childbearing age or when they are actually carrying a child. So they need more iron, calcium, and a lot of the foods that they have access to aren't really high in iron and calcium. If you think of those, they're really high protein foods, and often in developing countries, high protein foods are the foods that are lacking. Some aid agencies actually have supplementation programs where they'll go and give women supplements just to help them during pregnancy and breastfeeding. The reason women and children often have access or have limited access to food is due to religious or cultural issues. Often the men will eat first, women and children are last. Often women are responsible for a lot of the work, so their nutritional needs actually increase, but they're not getting the food to support that. And just have a think about women who are breastfeeding. They actually need to be consuming a lot of nutrition. So you could imagine if they're not eating very much, their breast milk's actually really low in nutrition as well. And then if they're using formula, their water's really dirty. So babies aren't getting the nutrition they need. And a lot of them, as we've seen before, will die before they're the age of 5. I've just put some statistics here for you about women in African countries, and if you have a look at these, you'll see that women are actually responsible for a lot of the roles in the household. They make up a third of the workforce, they're 70% of the workers on farms, 60 to 80% of the labour to actually get food organised. They are actually 80% in charge of storing the food, transporting it from farm to village. And we've looked before that women are mostly responsible for the carrying of water too. The fifth group who don't have access to adequate amounts of food are elderly people, and that's for a number of reasons. The first thing is they generally need less kilojoules of energy, but they still need vitamins and minerals. And a lot of the time, if they're not hungry, they'll be eating your really high carb foods rather than your fruits and vegetables and things they need to prepare. So while they're getting less energy, they're also getting less nutrients that they need. In developing countries, they're more susceptible to infections from the poor water and poor food supply. You might know elderly people who live on their own. They can't really shop as often. They don't like to cook. A lot of them, because they're on their own, don't cook meals at all, and then they're not hungry, so they're not getting the nutrients they need. People who also have mental issues like dementia, they lose their memory, they lose that ability to look after themselves and make decisions. So they can't actually make good decisions regarding their food choices, and then they don't have access to the nutrition that they need to help them get better. The last group we're going to have a look at are people with chronic illness, and that word chronic means that their illness is ongoing and affects their day-to-day living on an ongoing basis. So people who do have chronic illness have very specific nutrient requirements, and depending on what their problem is or depending on what they need more of. But if you are chronically ill, often you can't have a job because you're sick all the time, and without a job, no money, and then that affects your ability to purchase nutritious foods and the foods that you need to get your specific nutrients. Also, if you're sick, you're not able to absorb nutrients as well. So even if you are eating the best food, maybe you're not absorbing what you need as well. Another group that fit in with this are people with alcohol and drug problems, and they face malnutrition because lack of appetite, that lack of ability to shop and prepare meals, no money, no motivation to eat nutritious foods. That lack of money also affects the priorities, so they'll spend money on what they think is more important, and often food isn't on that list. And people with alcohol and drug problems, they need more vitamins like vitamin B, iron and magnesium to actually get better and overcome their addictions. And without eating fruit and vegetables and high protein foods, what happens is they can't actually overcome their issues. So just to finish up today, I want you to have a think about, there are a lot of people who don't have enough food, but it's not just the poor people and the homeless people we see on the streets. Things I want you to have a think about is, how bad is the food equity situations for Australians? Often when we think of people who don't have food, we think about people in developing countries, and it's actually people in Australia as well. Another thing I want you to think about is, should people who are homeless actually have access to food vouchers and soup kitchens? Should that be something that's available in all countries, not just developed countries like Australia? And the last thing maybe to think about is, what can you do to help people who don't have access to good food and nutrition? Maybe it's not about giving money, but maybe it's about giving time to people, or if you know someone who's old in your street, offering to go and shop for them, or maybe cook extra meals and then send them over to them. So they're the things I want you to have a think about this week, and we'll discuss them in class. Make sure that you've got your notes up to date, that your glossary is up to date as well, and we'll have a talk about food equity when I see you next week.